Welcome to a new episode of Leipzig Studies in Religion. In this series, we present publications by researchers from the Institute for the Study of Religion at Leipzig University. Today, we are taking a deep dive into a piece of scholarship that really, it sits right at the heart of how we even do history and sociology of religion.
It's a foundational question.
It really is. The article is titled Comparative Secularities, Tracing Social and Epistemic Structures Beyond the Modern West. And it's by Christoph Klein, who is a professor for the history of religion, and Monica Wohl-Robsar, a professor for cultural sociology.
And this was published back in 2021 in the journal Method and Theory in the Study of Religion.
So the central mission of this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack one of the most persistent and honestly one of the most explosive questions in the field.
Oh, absolutely.
Can we even use the word religion when we're talking about cultures outside of the modern West? Is that even a valid thing to do?
It's basically the identity crisis of the entire academic study of religion boiled down to one question. On one side, you have the post-colonial and deconstructivist critiques.
Right.
And they argue very passionately that religion is a purely Western, a Eurocentric category.
An imposition.
Exactly. They see it as linked to colonialism, and they say it should only be the object of our analysis. We should study how the category was imposed, but we should never, ever use it as an analytical tool ourselves.
Which, if you take that to its logical conclusion, means you can't compare anything.
You can't.
If every single phenomenon is totally unique and local, the whole discipline of comparative history it falls apart.
It shatters, yeah. And that, of course, leads you to the opposite camp. They follow some of the classic figures in the study of religion, and they argue that if you want to compare or categorize anything across time and space, you absolutely need a second-order generic concept.
Meta-language.
A meta-language, exactly. Something like religion is necessary to even establish a comparative horizon. Without it, the discipline just fractures into a million disconnected fields.
So we're stuck between radical particularism on one side and kind of simplistic universalism on the other. And this is where Klein and Wohl-Robsar come in. They're trying to find a third path.
A way through the dilemma.
They want to maintain the rigor of comparative historical research, but without relying on a category like religion that is, potentially anachronistic and Western-centric.
And their solution is actually, I think, quite ingenious. They shift the focus. So instead of obsessing over what counts as religion, they turn the lens around and look at secularity.
Okay.
They use the concept of secularity itself as their basis for comparison, their tertium comparationis, to use the Latin term.
But why does that pivot help? Aren't religion and secularity just two sides of the same coin?
No.
You can't define one without the other.
They are, but changing the focus completely changes the historical question you ask. If you start your research looking for religion, you're basically just searching for Western prototypes, right? You're looking for faith, for doctrine, for scripture.
Things that look like Christianity.
Things that look like Christianity, exactly. But if you start with secularity, you start asking a totally different set of questions.
Mm-hmm.
You ask, what were the pre-existing social and epistemic structures within a non-Western society that allowed it to adopt or appropriate or even internally generate something that functions like the modern religious-secular divide?
Okay, so we're not looking for the phenomenon itself. We're looking for the conditions that made the Western category, when it eventually arrived, seem familiar or sticky.
Precisely. That's a perfect way to put it. And that framing is why they explicitly draw an analogy to Schmiel-Eisenstadt's multiple modernities approach.
Yeah.
It allows them to acknowledge that yes, Western models have global influence, that's undeniable, but that influence always lands on culturally specific ground. And the result is a multiplicity of secularities, not one single global endpoint.
That makes a lot of sense. So before we dive into the history, let's make sure we've defined our terms because the authors are extremely specific here. We've got three crucial concepts: secularism, secularization, and then their key term, secularity.
Yes, and you really need to be able to tell them apart.
Let's nail that down for the listener.
Okay. Secularism is the easiest one. It's the philosophical or political program, the ideology, that advocates for the separation of spheres like church and state. It's what activists or politicians do.
It's an E-ism.
It's an E-ism, exactly. Then you have secularization. This is the classic sociological process of differentiation. It's the diminishing influence of religious institutions on society, or maybe the decline in personal belief over time. It's what sociologists traditionally measure.
Okay, and that brings us to the third one, secularity. the one they build their entire comparative framework on. This one is the trickiest. Can you sort of translate its very academic definition for us?
I'll do my best. So the authors define secularity structurally. And the critical insight here is that we are not looking for God or faith or belief. We are looking for the historical moment when a culture started sorting everything into two very specific bins, a designated sacred bin and a non-sacred or mundane bin.
The sorting mechanism itself.
That's it. So secularity is defined as the interrelated social and epistemic structures where relevant actors within that society conceptually cast social configurations into a binary taxonomy, religious or non-religious.
So it's the existence of that internal conceptual sorting mechanism that becomes the basis for comparison.
That's the key.
The sorting mechanism. That's a much clearer way to think about it. So if we take this structural approach to, say, studying modernizing cultures in Asia, how does looking for the binary sorting mechanism reveal something that just looking for religion would miss?
It forces us to ask a deeper question. What structural conditions had to be present for that binary split to even make sense to the local population?
Right.
If you just parachute in looking for religion, you miss all the subtle internal differentiation that happened long before contact with the West. The authors argue that this endogenous, this homegrown social differentiation served as the structural condition that allowed the external Western concept to be appropriated so cleanly.
Okay, let's start tracing those precursors then. Instead of searching for the word religion, we are now looking for these functional equivalents. What does that actually look like on the ground in, say, a pre-modern society?
Well, they start by looking for observable sociocultural formations. So these are the groups that eventually became modern religions, things like Buddhist sagas or institutions connected to Taoism.
Okay.
And crucially, these formations were often involved in a huge spectrum of social activities, politics, economic management, community welfare, you name it.
It wasn't just spiritual stuff.
Not at all. And the key is identifying that endogenous social differentiation within those formations. These structures aren't just ideas in people's heads. They are what the authors call real social facts with deontic power.
That's a high-level bit of jargon.
It is. It's very academic, but it simply means they create desire-independent reasons for action. They organize human behavior, regardless of what any one individual might want. Think of a centralized monastic structure or specific object of worship that has power over you.
So we're looking for evidence of a sustained, institutionalized system of differentiation that actually commands people to do things.
Yes. And the real acid test for whether a distinct subdomain existed, even if it didn't have a formal name like religion, is competition.
Competition.
A social subdomain becomes visible when a plurality of formations, let's say Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism in China, are perceived by local actors as standing in a relationship of competition and substitutability to one another. They are, in a sense, functional alternatives in a distinct field of action.
But wait, if we're just looking for competition, why isn't that just, politics or economics? How do they make sure this isn't just another form of projecting our categories onto the past?
That's a really important challenge. And the answer is the competition has to relate to fundamental questions of, let's call it ultimate orientation or normative guidance. It can't just be about territory or wealth.
Wow.
And the examples they give are perfect illustrations of this type of existential competition.
What are some of them?
Well, think about medieval China. You have these famous debates, mutual attacks, apologies flying back and forth between Taoists and Buddhists. These weren't just petty squabbles, they were systemic arguments over whose cosmological system provided the superior path for the ruler and for the population. They were fighting over functional equivalence.
Or I suppose an even clearer example would be the act of conversion itself.
Precisely. I mean, if individuals can convert from one to the other, it means they perceive the systems as functionally equivalent alternatives. The authors cite this great example of Fukansai Heibian in 16th century Japan.
Yeah.
He converted from Buddhism to Christianity, and then later he converted back to a specific Buddhist sect. That back and forth movement shows that, in the eyes of the actors themselves, these systems were interchangeable normative orientation systems within a distinct field, a field that was capable of hosting the later concept of religion.
This brings us perfectly to the Japan case study, which is really the most tangible illustration of their whole methodology. And the authors pose this fantastic, provocative question. Why did Buddhism become Shukyu, that's pronounced Shukyo, the modern Japanese word for religion, but rice cultivation did not.
Right, and it all comes down to the pre-existing epistemic structures. This is the second crucial component of secularity. It's about the socially generated, culturally transmitted patterns of classification and interpretation that already existed in Japan. These structures acted as a kind of filter for the incoming Western concept.
So what filter did Buddhism have that made it so easy to slot into that shukyo bin?
It had institutional and textual rigor. Historically, Buddhism already possessed all the structural characteristics that were compatible with the Western Christian model. It had a fixed, authoritative set of scriptures. It had a clear organizational structure centered around monastic orders and temples, known as Tera,
Doctrine.
and established doctrinal traditions called shushi, which you pronounce shushi. So because of these internal structures, its functional equivalence to Christianity, and thus its classification as a religion, was pretty much unquestionable to Japanese reformers even as early as the late 16th century.
And Shinto, which today we almost reflexively just call a religion, it lacked those structures.
Completely. Traditional Shinto, which is pronounced Shinto, was primarily focused on court rituals and very local cults. It lacked a coherent doctrinal system, a Q, pronounced Q. It didn't have clear membership rules or a centralized organization in the same way Buddhism did. And because it lacked those very specific structures, the Meiji reformers in the 19th century could proclaim its supposedly non-religious character. They could declare it haishukyu.
And why would they want to do that?
Well, by classifying it as non-religious, they could integrate it directly into the state apparatus as a kind of national ethic, without violating the new state mandate for religious freedom. The existing internal classification system determined what could be kept out of the new category just as much as what went in.
That is such a critical takeaway. The adoption of a Western term like religion wasn't a blank slate process at all. It was constrained by existing local conceptual resources.
Exactly.
So this led us to the final structural condition the authors investigate. What was it that favored the emergence of this binary schema in the first place? Why did this two-bin sorting system develop?
They point to two main dynamics. First, the emergence of strong, institutionally defined clerical power. Specifically, you see this with monastically organized institutions, which you find in both Christianity and Buddhism. Monasteries. They often function as what the authors call conceptual heterotopias. They cultivate a rationalized, salvific life that is meant to be a deliberate counter-design to the messy, imperfect, mundane world, or seizoku in Japanese. That internal focus naturally promotes a clean conceptual split.
A sort of us versus them, or here versus out there.
Yes, and second, and maybe even more powerfully, dual power structures. The chronic, centuries-long competition between political power, the military, the state, and powerful temple nobility inherently promotes binary modes of distinction. Each side needs to carve out its own autonomous sphere.
And this dual power structure existed in medieval Japan long before the Meiji Restoration.
Oh, for centuries.
Yeah.
The medieval Japanese paradigm of the interdependence of the ruler's nomosphere and the Buddha's nomosphere, the term is ijibubushi, is the perfect structural analog.
An nomosphere is another one of those academic terms.
It is, but it's simple enough. It just means the sphere of law and authority. And this paradigm, ijibubushi, was a powerful binary distinction designed specifically to legitimize and safeguard the institutional autonomy of the Buddhist orders, the jike pronounced jike from the state, the byuke or the kyujij. This distinction was centuries old.
So the Japanese state and the major Buddhist orders were already operating within a structural binary framework that defined their separate spheres of authority.
They were.
So when the Western-related secular divide arrived in the 19th century, it didn't create the distinction from scratch. It just provided a ready-made modern vocabulary for an existing structural relationship.
That's it. The adoption of the Western framework appeared, as the authors put it, downright natural. It felt natural because the internal endogenous structures were already primed for this exact type of binary sorting. And this is the core evidence for their whole argument about the multiplicity of secularities.
This deep dive really provides, I think, a necessary and much more nuanced methodology for anyone studying global history. It lets scholars proceed with their research without just anachronistically slapping the label religion onto everything.
And to sort of summarize the author's most significant theses. First, Comparative historical research is entirely possible, but it requires shifting that tertium comparationis, the basis for comparison. You shift it from the culturally loaded term religion to the formally defined structural concept of secularity as a binary mode of distinction.
So you compare the sorting systems, not the contents of the bins.
You've got it. Second, and this is maybe the most consequential point, those pre-existent endogenous social and epistemic structures, meaning the local taxonomies, the local classification systems, the local power dualities, they had a decisive shaping influence on how external Western knowledge regimes were ultimately appropriated and institutionalized.
The local ground shapes what grows there.
And third, this entire process guarantees that global modernity results not in a single homogeneous secular world, but in a true multiplicity of culture-specific secularities, each one rooted in its own diverse historical conditions and local conceptual resources.
It's just a really powerful argument. And it reminds us that to truly understand global phenomena, you have to dig into the deepest internal logic of categorization that a culture possesses. We have to look beyond these simplistic West versus the rest models and recognize that historical differentiation. It happens everywhere, on its own terms. Thank you for listening, and we hope to welcome you back for another episode of our series Leipzig Studies in Religion.